Have you ever been on a business trip? What's the situation regarding travel expenses in Germany?
Welcome to YD. Why do Germans do things the way they do?
I've recently been looking into travel expenses for work, not just in Germany, but also in Austria, Switzerland, Romania, the USA, and a few other countries. And there are actually significant differences. I'm neither a solicitor or lawyer nor a tax advisor, so I'm simply compiling information and cannot provide legal advice. Let's start with a brief overview of what is available internationally, then move on to understanding and calculating expenses in Germany, and finally look at what is typical in German companies. First, we need to clarify a few terms that I will be using below. There is a domestic, inside the own country, and the foreign, another country, in most cases. In the USA, even another state or certain regions within a state are considered foreign, whereas for Germans, the whole of Germany is domestic and other countries are foreign. This is usually important for the amount of the allowances, except perhaps in Switzerland. Then there are tax-free, flat-rated tax, and taxable rates. Well, except in Switzerland, where there is probably nothing tax-free. And then there is a fundamentally different method of calculation. In Germany, calculations are based on calendar days, in contrast to Romania, for example, which calculates in time periods. To clarify, if I set off my journey at 10 a.m. on Monday and return home at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, in Germany this is counted as a partial day or the day of arrival on Monday, a full day on Tuesday, and a partial day or day of departure on Wednesday. For Romanians, the first day runs from Monday 10 to Tuesday 10, and the second day from Tuesday 10 to Wednesday 10, and depending on the region, there may be an additional charge for the period from Wednesday 10 to 18. The way domestic and international travel are categorized also varies. In Switzerland, I'm not sure if any distinction is made at all. In Italy, there is one rate for domestic travels and one for international travels. In Romania, pretty much every other country has its own rate. In Germany, some regions have an additional rate, for example, Bern or Geneva in Switzerland, or Los Angeles or Washington in the USA. In Austria, for neighboring countries, a distinction is made depending on whether you are more or less than 50 kilometers from the border. And the US has well over 1,500 different rates for within the USA or abroad. The understanding of what the money is for also varies. In Romania, there's a minimum rate and tax-free maximum rate, which is reduced if the employee is provided with meals, but never falls below the minimum rate. In Germany, the daily allowance is intended solely to cover the additional cost of meal. Under German law, anyone who receives full board from the employer whilst traveling is not entitled to any tax-free allowance. There are often also allowances for accommodations as well. In Germany, an employer may pay this accommodation allowance tax-free if, for example, the employee is unable to provide a hotel bill. The employer can, of course, also reimburse other costs, such as parking or toll charges, tax-free upon presentation of proof. Self-employed people can claim these costs as income-related expenses on their tax returns. But what exactly constitutes a business trip or work-related travel? First of all, you need to check your employment contract. Here's a video on the subject. What is listed there as your erste Tätigkeitsstätte, primary place of work? This could be your home office. Usually it is a workplace to which you are assigned, but sometimes it's also a specific area, for example, the city center if a caretaker has to look after various properties. If you are working continuously for more than 8 hours away from home or away from your primary place of work, then that constitutes a business trip. For someone who always works from home, even a single day spent at the office can count as a business trip. Conversely, if you are able to work from home for a day, this does not apply. However, this also covers travel to clients, trade fairs, or construction sites, as well as driving duties as a long-distance professional driver. Unlike in other countries, there's no minimum distance requirement that must be covered for a trip to count as business travel. Travel policies vary depending on the job and the company. Those working in sales as service technicians, consultants, or fitters will likely have to travel a lot, whereas office administrators or forklift operators in a warehouse will do so less frequently. Sometimes you are required to apply for the trip in advance, but this is a company rule rather than a legal requirement. However, for travel abroad, you need a A1 certificate, which must be provided in advance by your employer to prove that you have health insurance and are paying social security contributions. Sometimes the company will also assist with the arrangements, booking hotels or flights. Large companies also have agreements with car hire firms, hotel chains, or airlines. All of this is set out in the company policy. After the trip, a travel expense claim must be submitted. This must state when the journey began, either from home or from the office, when a border was crossed, for example, if traveling by car or train to a neighboring country, or when you landed if traveling by plane. The same applies if the trip involves destinations in several countries. For example, if you first travel to Salzburg in Austria and then 2 days later to Zurich in Switzerland before returning home to Stuttgart the following day. As travel expenses in Germany are calculated in calendar days, a single rate applies for allowances on any given day, whether for the meal allowance or a possible accommodation allowance. This list sets out the flat rates for all countries and regions in accordance with German tax law. So if we set off from Stuttgart to Salzburg on Monday, say at 7 a.m., the journey takes about 4 hours. And as Salzburg is right on the border, we might cross the border around 12:10 p.m. and arrive at the customer's premise at 12:30 p.m. The rate for Austria then applies for the entire day of travel. The journey to Zurich would probably take us through Germany again and last around 5 hours. If you were to set off on Wednesday after lunch at 1 p.m., you might be out of Austria at 1:15, back in Germany, and after 3 to 4 hours at Lindau on the Lake Constance, where you would first head back into Austria and then perhaps enter Switzerland at 5:15. Here, the Swiss rate applies for the whole day because it always depends on which country you reached before midnight. On Friday, you head home at 4 p.m. It only takes 2.5 to 3 hours, and you'll probably be across the border after 30 minutes. Here it's different. Although you are in Germany before midnight, the last foreign country applies, so it is still Switzerland. Monday would there be the day of arrival in Austria at €33, Tuesday and Wednesday each a full Austrian rate of €50, Thursday €70 for Switzerland, and Friday, the day of departure, €47 as a Swiss rate. However, this only applies if the company does not pay for meals, and it's likely to do so if it pays for the hotel, which usually includes breakfast. The additional meal expenses, Verpflegungsmehraufwände, as they are termed in the law, are calculated on the assumption that when traveling, one does not know where to find the cheapest food of reasonable quality and therefore incurs additional costs compared to eating at home. The daily rate consists of 20% for breakfast and 40% each for lunch and dinner. At the rate of €50 for a full day in Austria, 20% would therefore be €10 for breakfast and €20 each for lunch and dinner. So if breakfast is included in the price of the hotel in Austria, there would be still €40 left for the full day. And if our sales representatives were to treat the client to a lunch paid for by the company, he would have to deduct a further €20 for the lunch. If the journey is made in a private car, covering perhaps 1,100 kilometers in total, 30 cents per kilometer driven can be reimbursed. In addition, tolls in Austria or Switzerland would be reimbursed, as well as hotel costs and similar expenses. And it is also typical for German companies to pay the tax-free allowance that the employee could otherwise claim on the tax return. However, this only applies to travel expenses or additional meal expenses. The flat rate allowance for accommodations can only be paid by employers. You cannot claim these back on your tax return. Some companies even pay a little more. Firstly, there are so-called Mercer rates, which have been calculated by the firm Mercer. These are calculated in the local currency. They are usually slightly higher than the tax-free rate in Germany. Now, for a bit of tax law. The standard rate for a country is listed, for example, the 50 euro for a full day in Austria. This can be paid tax-free, but must be reduced. If breakfast at a hotel in Austria is covered by the company for the whole day, the amount is reduced to 40 euro. However, the company can pay the same rate again as a lump sum taxed amount. This rate does not, however, needed to be reduced. Thus, in the example, 40 euro could be paid tax-free and 50 euro as a lump sum taxed amount. In most cases, these Mercer rates are then settled in the way one part tax-free and the other as a lump sum taxed amount. However, this is not standard practice in Germany as one receives more than the tax-free rates. Oh, and if, for example, the client invites you to lunch or dinner without being a contractual obligation, your company has not paid for it. Whether or not you are allowed to use your own car varies from company to company. Some companies insist that you use a car from their fleet or provide a hire car. If you use a hire car, you will be reimbursed for the cost of the hire car and the fuel cost rather than the 30 cents per kilometer driven. Similarly, it varies whether the company reimburses first class or second class train tickets. Incidentally, even if you are traveling to a job interview, the company is obliged to reimburse your travel cost at least up to the cost of a second class train ticket. And if the journey is so long that you have to stay overnight, the company must also cover the accommodation costs. Remarks, addition, and comments in the comments. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.